The conference room on the 40th floor of Bennett Dynamics smelled like fresh coffee and old money. And Jack Donovan stood at the far end of the polished walnut table in a canvas work jacket that still carried a faint trace of engine grease no amount of washing had ever fully lifted, holding a scuffed aluminum case in both hands, the way another man might hold something fragile, because in a sense he was. 12 executives sat around that table, phones face down, tablets glowing, and at the head of it sat Caroline Bennett, 41 years old, sharp-suited, sharper-tongued, the woman who had inherited a defense contracting empire from her father and spent 6 years proving to the board she deserved it. She looked at Jack for exactly 2 seconds before her eyes moved past him toward the door, expecting someone else, someone with a badge and a briefing folder and a haircut that cost more than Jack's truck payment. When her assistant confirmed quietly that this was the presenter, that this was the man behind the suspension retrofit on today's agenda, Caroline Bennett laughed, not cruelly at first, almost reflexively, the kind of laugh that escapes before a person decides whether to feel embarrassed about it. "I'm sorry," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "I think there's been a mistake. We're expecting an engineering firm, not," she gestured at him, at the jacket, at the case, at the boots that had been resoled twice, not a scrapyard. A few people around the table smiled the way people smile when the boss smiles first. Jack didn't flinch. He set the case down on the table with a soft click of the latches and said nothing, because he had learned a long time ago that the loudest response to being underestimated was silence, and because 10-year-old Emma Donovan was waiting for him at her grandmother's house tonight, expecting him home for dinner, not headlines. He opened the case. Inside, nested in gray foam, sat a suspension module no bigger than a toaster, matte black, deceptively simple, and Caroline's laughter was still hanging in the air, not yet gone, when the double doors at the back of the room opened without a knock and a broad-shouldered man in a dress uniform crossed 3 stars and a lifetime of command into that room like he owned the floor. Beneath it, every phone stayed face down now for a different reason. The general did not look at Caroline Bennett. He walked the length of that walnut table, past the engineers, past the board members, straight to the man in the work jacket, and extended his hand with the kind of respect that cannot be faked or bought. "Good to see you again, Sergeant Donovan," he said, and the room went so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning became the loudest thing in it. Somewhere in that stillness, a pen rolled off the table and hit the floor, and nobody moved to pick it up, to find out how a man in a scrapyard jacket ended up being greeted by a 4-star general in front of the CEO who had just mocked him. Stay until the very end, because what happens next changes everything about how this room sees him. And if stories like this speak to you, about the ones who get overlooked until the truth finally walks through the door, tell us in the comments, because so many of you watching have lived some version of this yourselves. There's a debate worth having in the middle of a moment like this one, whether the credentialed newcomers running rooms like that one have any real right to judge the competence of the people who actually built the things they're now selling, or whether formal titles should always outweigh the kind of experience that gets earned in mud and grease instead of business school. 3 years ago, none of this existed. 3 years ago, Jack Donovan was just a man trying to keep a scrapyard open on the edge of a county nobody important ever drove through, and Caroline Bennett was just a rising as executive fighting to prove to a board of men twice her age that her father's company hadn't made a mistake putting her in charge. Back then, Donovan Salvage and Restoration sat on 4 acres of cracked asphalt outside a town called Millhaven, a patchwork of storage containers, cannibalized trucks, and one covered bay where Jack did his real work after the yard closed for the day, restoring decommissioned military vehicles for collectors, museums, and the occasional government auction reseller. work that paid the bills in a town where the mill had closed a decade earlier and nothing had replaced it. He'd bought the place with severance money nobody knew the real size of, and he ran it alone except for a part-time hand named Walt Pruitt, 63 years old, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a press accident decades back. A man who had known Jack since before Jack ever wore a uniform and who never once asked him about the years in between. Jack lived 11 minutes away in a 2-bedroom rental with his daughter Emma, 10 years old. Quick with numbers, quicker with questions. The kind of kid who noticed when her father's jaw tightened at the evening news whenever it mentioned troop deployments, though she'd learned young not to ask why. Jack never explained. He'd made a decision years earlier, when Emma was still small enough to ride on his shoulders, that whatever had happened overseas, whatever had happened after, would stay buried where it couldn't touch her. Because a girl needed a father who came home steady, not a father who came home talking about the things that had made him steady in the first place. Caroline Bennett, meanwhile, was 6 months into the hardest stretch of her professional life. Bennett Dynamics held a $900 million armored vehicle contract with the Department of Defense, a contract her father had negotiated a decade earlier, and that was now, under her leadership, failing a critical durability review because the suspension systems on 300 vehicles slated for overseas deployment kept fracturing under sustained off-road stress in testing, a defect that had already delayed delivery twice, and that threatened, if it wasn't solved within the fiscal quarter, to see the entire contract reassigned to a competitor, taking 1,100 jobs and the company's reputation down with it. The board had given her 90 days. Her chief engineering officer, a smooth, Ivy-credentialed man named Preston Cole, who had been with the company 11 years and who had quietly positioned himself as her likely successor if she failed, kept assuring her in board meetings that the fix was close, that his team had it handled, all while privately steering procurement away from a small aftermarket vendor list his own division had flagged as unqualified. A list that, buried 3 lines down, included Donovan Salvage and Restoration, whose name had come up because a field logistics officer, a man named Colonel Reyes, who'd served 2 tours in vehicles fitted with Jack's unofficial modifications, had mentioned it once in a memo that never made it past Cole's desk. Caroline Bennett had never seen that memo. She only knew she was running out of time, running out of trust, and running, without knowing it yet, straight toward the one man in the county who actually understood why those suspensions kept failing. A man she was about to insult in front of 12 people before she ever learned his name. The humiliation, when it finally came, didn't arrive the way Jack expected it to. He had assumed, walking into Bennett Dynamics that first time with a written proposal and 3 years of field data, that if anyone dismissed him, it would happen slowly, politely, buried in corporate language about Vanner qualification standards and established engineering partnerships. Instead, it happened fast, and it happened in front of everyone, 3 weeks before the scene that would later freeze that boardroom solid. Preston Cole had arranged the initial pitch meeting himself, smiling the whole time, telling Jack it was just a formality before the real presentation to Caroline. And Jack, who had no reason yet to distrust a stranger's smile, had shown up in the same work jacket, case in hand, and walked into a room where Cole had quietly seated 3 of his own engineers early, men who'd been briefed beforehand to ask sharp, dismissive questions designed to make the vendor look unprepared, rather than to evaluate the actual technology. They asked about certifications Jack didn't have on paper, because the work he'd done overseas had never been credited to him in writing. They asked about manufacturing scale he couldn't yet demonstrate because he ran a 4-acre yard, not a factory. They asked, pointedly, whether he'd ever worked with systems of this classification level before. And Jack, bound by an old non-disclosure agreement he'd signed a decade earlier and never once broken, said only that he'd had relevant field experience, which to men already looking for a reason to dismiss him sounded like exactly nothing. Cole ended the meeting early, thanked Jack for his time with the practiced warmth of a man closing a door softly so it wouldn't seem like he'd slammed it, and told him the company would keep his information on file. Jack drove the 11 minutes home that evening and told Emma dinner was ready and didn't mention any of it, because that was what he did with the things that stung. He set them down without ceremony and moved on to the next task, because there was always a next task, and because a 10-year-old girl didn't need to inherit her father's disappointments, along with everything else he was already trying to shield her from. What Jack didn't know was that Cole had gone further than a polite dismissal, worried that Colonel Reyes's memo might surface again, and that Caroline might actually authorize a real evaluation of Donovan's suspension system, which internal testing Cole had privately run and buried showed outperformed his own team's design by a significant margin. Cole quietly flagged Donovan Salvage in the vendor database as non-compliant with federal contracting insurance minimums, a technicality that was narrowly true on paper and entirely irrelevant in practice, since Jack's insurance easily met state requirements and could have been upgraded in a single phone call had anyone asked him to. Nobody asked. The flag sat there instead, a small red mark in a system nobody outside procurement ever looked at twice, quietly ensuring that if Jack's name came up again, it could be dismissed instantly and without discussion. It was, Cole reasoned, protecting his own division's timeline, protecting the credit that would come to him if his team's fix eventually worked, protecting 11 years of climbing the ladder from a man in a work jacket who didn't even know he was competing. 3 weeks later came the boardroom, the aluminum case, the laugh that wasn't quite cruel but wasn't kind either, and the general's hand extended down the length of a walnut table toward a name Caroline Bennett hadn't yet connected to a face. In the frozen seconds after, "Good to see you again, Sergeant Donovan," General Marcus Whitfield turned, almost as an afterthought, to the woman at the head of the table and said evenly that he hoped Bennett Dynamics understood exactly whose suspension retrofit design had kept his convoy alive outside Kandahar in a winter he still thought about more than he let on, and that he'd flown in personally today specifically because his office had heard, through channels that clearly hadn't reached certain desks inside this building, that Jack Donovan's system was finally being considered for adoption. Caroline Bennett sat very still, the laughter she couldn't take back still echoing in a room gone silent, watching a decorated general shake the hand of a man she had just told to go back to his scrapyard, and understanding, with the particular clarity that comes only from genuine shame, that whatever had just happened in this room was going to require more than an apology to fix. Jack said nothing. He closed the aluminum case, thanked the general quietly for his time, and turned to leave, because he had come here to sell a suspension system, not to be recognized, and because recognition, he'd learned a long time ago, tended to cost more than it paid out. It would be 4 months before Caroline Bennett worked up the courage to drive out to Millhaven herself, and by then, the fractures in her company's contract, and in her own certainty about who deserved a seat at that table, would have spread far past anything a boardroom apology could repair. There's an old argument that runs underneath stories like this one, about whether a man who's kept quiet for years to protect the people he loves should have spoken up sooner, or whether silence, in his case, was never weakness at all but the only kind of protection he had left to give. And it's worth sitting with, because the answer isn't as simple as it sounds. The 4 months that followed did something to Caroline Bennett that no board meeting ever had. She kept replaying the sound of her own laughter, kept seeing Jack Donovan's face, which hadn't changed at all when she'd mocked him, hadn't hardened or flushed with anger, had simply absorbed it the way a man absorbs weather he's used to standing in. She pulled the vendor file on Donovan Salvage and Restoration herself, quietly after hours, and found the non-compliance flag Cole had planted, and found, when she looked closer, that the insurance minimum in question was a formality any vendor could resolve with a single underwriting call, which made her wonder, with a cold feeling settling into her stomach, why nobody in Cole's division had ever made that call. She requested the original Reyes memo from records and read it twice, then a third time, noting the date, noting that it predated the vendor flag by 6 weeks, noting that someone had clearly seen this name before and chosen, deliberately, to make sure it went nowhere. She said nothing to Cole. Instead, she called Colonel Reyes directly, a conversation that lasted 40 minutes and left her staring at her office window long after it ended, because Reyes didn't just confirm what the general had implied in that boardroom. He told her, in careful, precise military language, exactly what Sergeant First Class Jack Donovan had done 8 years earlier during a deployment that had gone wrong in ways still classified in places. How he'd redesigned suspension mountings under fire, using scavenged parts and instinct nobody had trained into him. How those modifications had held together 17 vehicles through terrain that should have disabled them all. How the official after-action report had credited the fix to field engineering adaptation without ever naming the sergeant who'd actually crawled underneath those vehicles at 3 a.m. to make it happen, because Jack had asked specifically that his name be left out of it, a request Reyes had honored out of respect and had regretted, quietly, for years. She found him at the yard on a gray Tuesday afternoon in October, driving the 11 minutes from the highway exit down a county road she'd never had reason to take before, past a faded sign reading Donovan Salvage and Restoration, in letters that had once been read, and she found Jack in the covered bay, sleeves pushed up, working alone on the underside of a half-restored transport truck while Walt Pruitt swept metal shavings a few feet away. Jack didn't stop working when she walked in, not out of rudeness, she'd realize later, but because stopping would have meant treating her arrival as more significant than it was. And Jack Donovan had never once in his adult life let anyone else decide what significance he assigned to his own dignity. She apologized. It came out clumsier than she'd rehearsed it in the car. Something about assumptions and pressure and a boardroom that ran too fast for anyone in it to look twice at what they were dismissing. And Jack listened to all of it without interrupting, then set down his wrench and told her quietly that he didn't need an apology. He needed her to actually look at the suspension data, because somewhere in her own building, a fix already existed, and it wasn't the one her chief engineer kept promising the board. He didn't ask for money. When she offered, reflexively, a formal contract with a number attached that would have solved every financial worry Donovan Salvage had accumulated over 3 lean years, Jack shook his head and said the only thing he wanted was for the work to go out under an honest name this time, whatever that name turned out to be, and for nobody else who did this kind of work in the shadows to spend 8 years wondering if it had mattered. She almost had that settled, almost had him agreeing to a formal evaluation the following week, when the second crisis landed, worse than the first. 3 of the already deployed vehicles using Cole's suspension design failed catastrophically during a live logistics run overseas. No injuries, but enough damage and enough delay that the Pentagon liaison overseeing the contract called an emergency review, giving Bennett Dynamics 30 days, not 90, to demonstrate a viable fix before the contract was formally reassigned. Caroline drove back to Millhaven that same night, headlights cutting through a countryside she was starting to know better than she'd expected to, and found Jack in the bay again, later than she should have called, and told him the truth, that she needed him now, not next quarter, not after a formal evaluation process that could take weeks she no longer had. and that she was asking him, as plainly as she knew how, to help her save something that 1,100 families depended on. Jack looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that weighed the request against the daughter waiting at home, against the years he'd spent protecting his own peace, against the sergeant's stripes he'd buried at the bottom of a drawer he hadn't opened since Emma was 2. Then he wiped his hands on a rag, nodded once, and said he'd need his own bay wired for around-the-clock work, and Walt Pruitt kept on the books properly this time. 30 days would pass in a blur neither of them saw coming, and somewhere in the middle of those 30 days, in the quiet hours after midnight surrounded by torque wrenches and cold coffee, Caroline Bennett would start noticing something about the man across the workbench from her that had nothing to do with suspension systems at all. The next 26 days looked, from the outside, like the most unglamorous kind of engineering work imaginable. Jack and Caroline hunched over torn-down suspension assemblies in a cold bay heated by a single kerosene heater, Walt running parts between them, takeout containers stacking up on a workbench nobody bothered to clear, and yet inside that unglamorous grind, something precise and specific kept happening that no consultant with a corner office had managed in 6 months. Jack didn't guess. He explained, in plain terms that took Caroline 3 days to fully follow, that Cole's design had over-engineered the load-bearing bracket to handle vertical stress while almost entirely underestimating lateral torque during high-speed off-road turns, the exact failure mode that had disabled convoy vehicles in Kandahar years earlier, and the exact failure mode, uncannily, that had just disabled 3 vehicles overseas last month. His fix wasn't exotic. It was a modified dual pivot mount, machined from a reinforced alloy he'd sourced through a small foundry 2 counties over. A solution that cost less than Cole's original design and weighed 4% lighter. Numbers Caroline checked twice because they seemed almost too clean to be real. She watched him work with a stillness she'd never associated with competence before. No wasted motion, no need to narrate his own brilliance, and she found herself, late one night around 1 a.m., asking him directly why he'd never told anyone what he'd done overseas. Why the sergeant who'd saved 17 vehicles and however many lives inside them had let the credit disappear into an after-action report nobody read. Jack was quiet for a while, wiping grease from a bracket that didn't need any more wiping, before he told her, briefly, that the version of himself who came home from that deployment had a daughter who needed a father who was present, not famous, and that every time he'd imagined stepping forward for recognition, he'd pictured instead reporters at his door, old commanding officers wanting statements, a spotlight that would have followed Emma to school long before she was old enough to understand why. He said it once, without elaboration, and went back to work, and Caroline understood, in the way people understand things they've never had to consider before, that some men build their whole lives around a kind of protection nobody ever thanks them for. The reveal, when it came, wasn't dramatic in the way Cole's unraveling was. On day 24, Caroline brought the new suspension design to a closed technical review with her own senior engineers, Cole among them, and watched Cole's composure crack in real time as one of his own junior engineers, a sharp analyst named Priya Anand who had quietly cross-referenced the vendor database months earlier and found the non-compliance flag time-stamped suspiciously close to the buried Reyes memo, laid both documents on the table without being asked and said, plainly, that someone had deliberately kept a superior design out of consideration to protect internal territory. Cole tried the same tone that had worked on him for 11 years. Smooth, dismissive, reasonable sounding, insisting this was a misunderstanding of standard vendor vetting procedure. But the numbers on the table told a story his tone couldn't talk over. And Caroline, for the first time in 6 years running that company, chose the numbers over the polish. She didn't fire him in that meeting. She simply said, evenly, that Bennett Dynamics would be moving forward with the Donovan suspension design effective immediately, credited under his name, and that a formal review of vendor evaluation practices would follow. A sentence that everyone in that room understood as the beginning of the end of Preston Cole's career at the company, whether or not it happened that same afternoon. Word moved fast after that. By the following week, the story of a decorated sergeant mistaken for a junk dealer and then vindicated by a 4-star general had somehow reached a local reporter, then a regional one, and Caroline found herself fielding calls, asking whether Bennett Dynamics would make a public statement, a question she hadn't yet asked Jack how he felt about, because some truths she was learning needed to be handled with the same care Jack used on a torque wrench. Not fast, not for show, but exactly right. 6 weeks would pass before that statement finally happened in front of every camera and every employee Bennett Dynamics had. And neither Jack nor Caroline would walk out of that room the same person who'd walked in. The press conference took place in the same 40th floor space where Caroline had once told Jack Donovan to go back to his scrapyard. Except this time the room held reporters, employees standing 3 deep along the back wall, General Whitfield seated in the front row in full uniform, and Emma Donovan, 10 years old, sitting beside her grandmother in a folding chair Caroline had insisted on having brought in specifically for her, because Caroline had learned over 6 weeks of long nights and longer conversations that nothing mattered more to Jack Donovan than his daughter's father's worth without it ever costing him his stillness. Caroline stood at the podium and told the room, plainly and without corporate polish, that the company's new suspension system, now saving an estimated $40 million in projected maintenance costs across the full vehicle fleet, had been designed by a man she'd once dismissed on sight. A man whose actual military record, now properly declassified and credited at his own request, had already saved lives years before anyone in this building had bothered to learn his name. She named the vendor flag, named the buried memo, named her own laughter that day in the boardroom, without excusing it, because she'd decided, somewhere in those 6 weeks, that real accountability didn't get to skip the parts that were hardest to say out loud. It cost her. The board questioned her judgment publicly for the first time in her tenure. A competitor tried, briefly, to poach 2 of her senior staff during the ensuing scrutiny, and she absorbed all of it without flinching, because she'd decided that the version of leadership her father had modeled for her, the version built on protecting whoever built the actual work, was worth more than a quarter of uncomfortable headlines. They offered for Jack Donovan everything a company like Bennett Dynamics knew how to offer: a title, a corner office, a public ceremony with his name etched into something permanent in the lobby, a licensing deal that would have made Donovan Salvage and Restoration wealthy several times over. Jack declined the office and the ceremony. What he asked for instead, quietly, in a private meeting with Caroline 2 days after the press conference, was a standing procurement pathway, specifically for small independent vendors and veterans, doing exactly the kind of overlooked field work he'd spent years doing without recognition. A pathway with Priya Anand appointed to oversee it, because she was the one who'd actually found the truth when it mattered. He asked that Walt Pruitt be brought on with full benefits and a proper title of his own. He asked for nothing, with his name printed larger than anyone else's. Caroline agreed to all of it before he'd finished asking. Months later, on an ordinary evening with no cameras and no board members watching, Caroline drove the 11 minutes out to Millhaven the way she now did most weeks, and found Jack in the covered bay. Emma perched on an overturned crate nearby, doing homework at a folding table. Jack had built her out of scrap steel and an old cabinet door, painted her favorite shade of blue because she'd asked once and he'd remembered. The bay was warmer now, properly wired, a new sign out front reading Donovan in 5 Engineering in letters that hadn't faded yet. Caroline sat down across from Jack at the workbench, picked up a torque wrench without needing to be asked what it was for anymore, and asked him, the way she'd started asking most evenings, what he was working on. He told her, in the same unhurried voice he used for everything, and somewhere in the middle of that quiet, ordinary exchange, Emma looked up from her homework and asked her father, without any particular weight in her voice, whether he was happy. And Jack looked at his daughter, and then, for just a moment, at Caroline, and said that he was, plainly, the way he said everything true. If you've ever been the person in the room nobody looked at twice, the one whose worth measured by a jacket instead of what was actually in their hands, I hope you know that rooms eventually catch up to the truth, even when it takes years, even when nobody claps for you along the way. That folding blue table in a scrapyard bay meant more to one quiet man than any office on the 40th floor ever could. And maybe that's the whole point of a story like this one, that the people worth watching for are rarely the ones announcing themselves the loudest. If you believe the quiet, overlooked people in your own life deserve to be truly seen, stay part of this story with us, subscribe, and stay close, because there's one more truth about that day in the boardroom we haven't told you yet.